Jill Murray. Here we go, everybody. Over to you, Jill.
Thanks, Alex. And it's great to be here again, and lovely to be able to talk to you about pragmatics, which is my favourite area of linguistics and language teaching. So I hope you're going to find this evening's class interesting and useful for you. A couple of things before we start. We'll be having some discussions, and what that will involve is you'll just be put in breakout rooms. You won't be required to write anything, but during that 10-minute discussion, I just want you to talk freely and feel comfortable about what you're doing. So those discussions won't be recorded. Afterwards, we'll have a brief feedback session, which will be recorded. So, you know, feel free to participate in that if you feel comfortable doing that. I'm hoping that I can get all of this done in 1 hour, but it's possible that I may go over a little bit. So if you need to just quietly slip away, that's okay. But I'll try very hard to get it done in the hour that we have together. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see the PowerPoint. Can everybody see that? I hope you can. And I'm starting my slideshow there. If you have any difficulties or any problems, send a message in the chat line and Alex will be monitoring that. So I'm going to talk to you about pragmatics, and I know that some of you might have been to my previous session. And because some people haven't been to that session, I'm going to be repeating a few of the basic things that I talked about in that, but the activities and things that we talk about will be a bit different. So first of all, why is pragmatics so important? Well, if you make an error in grammar, people generally will understand you. They'll generally find a way to understand you. If you make an error in the realm of pragmatics, which is a much deeper, more value-laden area of linguistics, people will think that you're maybe not such a nice person, or not so sensitive, or not so educated, or something like that. So it's important to understand about pragmatics to be able to enable your students not to make errors in pragmatics that are going to cause them interpersonal difficulties when they communicate. Now, why context? Well, context helps us to understand meaning. And I'm going to give you a little example of this from real life before we get into the language-based ones. What does this mean? Well, when somebody puts on their right-hand indicator, generally your mind will go to the fact that if you're approaching an intersection, probably what they mean by that is that they're turning right. Okay, in fact, you probably thought when you saw it, right-hand indicator means in Australia that the person is turning right. However, if they do it on a two-lane road where there are no other places to turn, then probably what they're trying to say is that they're changing lanes. It's the same signal, but a different context, and there's a different meaning. There are other meanings as well. If, for example, they are parked by the side of the road and they make that signal, then it probably means they're going to pull out into the traffic and join the traffic. So when somebody makes that signal, I infer that meaning, but I infer it with the extra information given by the context where we are. And also I expect that in that context, if they've got that information to give to me, they're going to do it by making that signal. So context in different cultures might actually be different. So for example, you can't necessarily assume that if you go to a part of the world where things are done differently, that the same signals are going to have the same meaning, even if the context is the same. So context helps us to make decisions about what to do and say. Everything that we say when we communicate is within some kind of context. So what we're going to talk about tonight is all related to that and how that is important in our language teaching and in our students' learning. For example, we're going to talk tonight about pragmatics and culture. I'm going to give you a chance to think a bit about the pragmatic toolkit of your language. All languages have a different sort of repertoire of things that we use to make pragmatic meanings. And we'll also be talking about teaching and learning pragmatics in community language schools, some of the challenges and opportunities. And then we'll be focusing on how you can create context and incorporate pragmatics in your teaching. Now, if there are any people here who don't know what pragmatics is, you're probably panicking by now, so let me help you by defining it. Okay? Pragmatics is the study of language from the point of view of the users. So it's not the same as grammar or vocabulary or skills. It's a special area of language which is actually related to all kinds of communication. So especially the choices they make, the constraints they encounter in using language in social interaction, and the effects of their language use on other participants during the communication. So we're going to unpack what that definition actually means. It means making language choices that are appropriate for the situation and the cultural context, and understanding the sort of meanings that are made by other people, right, within those contexts. Now, any of you who've travelled or who've lived in other cultures know that you sometimes know the language, you know the words, but you just don't know what's okay or not okay to do. And you don't necessarily know what's an okay way to do that thing, right? Even if you can translate directly from your first language into the language of the country that you're travelling in. And this is because language choices are so closely related to culture. And understanding culture is a very deep aspect of knowledge, right? So we're going to look at a diagram that might be familiar to some of you about what we can think of as the unseen parts of culture. When you think of culture, you probably think of things like music, dance, food, holidays, games, the parts of culture that we can see, okay? But when we go deeper into culture, there's a lot more to it. And some of these other aspects are not so obviously on the surface. So if we just teach music, dance, food, poetry, costumes, that sort of thing, we're dealing with one part of culture. And we often tend to do that sort of separately in a way to our main areas of teaching. But whenever we teach language, we have to think about these deeper parts of culture as well. And they're the cultural values and beliefs that influence the way that we use language. And what we call the system of pragmatics is what we actually use to communicate in a cultural context. Now, cultures can be of different types. If you think about Australia, in Australia, people generally think very much about not imposing on other people. Like when we want to ask somebody something, we always try to give them a way out. You know, we don't want to be seen to be pressuring or pushing people. That's one of the reasons why we have such a low vaccine uptake at the moment, because it's not part of the culture to make people do things. You just want to give them the space. You want to give them the opportunity to decide for themselves. But other cultures are not always like that. So if we look at these two examples, and some of you have seen this slide before, I think, some cultures focus on giving people space and not imposing on them, and being less direct in the way that that people interact. So for example, in a culture like that, you might make an invitation in this way. Look, there's no obligation, but if you're not too busy, I don't suppose you'd like to come to my birthday party. So to us, that sounds kind of nice. Maybe it's a little bit over the top, but nice in that we're giving the other person the choice, and we're showing our respect by giving them choice. Other cultures are more strongly focused on showing warmth and involvement and connection, and they tend to be more direct. So a culture like that would probably invite someone in a different way, like, you absolutely must come to my birthday party. I won't take no for an answer. So these two people they're both basically doing the same thing. They're inviting someone, they want them to come, they hope that they'll come. But in the first culture, it's really important not to push them too much. And in the second culture, it's really important to make them feel involved and part of things. We sometimes call the first kind negative politeness societies, and the second kind positive politeness societies. And this affects the language forms that you choose when you're doing this thing. So it shows that we can't just translate directly word for word from one language to another. Now, each language has a different, what I'm calling a pragmatic toolkit. You can call it a repertoire or something like that, but a different set of tools for making these cultural meanings using language in context. And to make it clearer, I'll show you a few examples of that. So the pragmatic toolkit of every language is different because it reflects the culture. And this is things like, for example, performing speech acts differently. The speech act is when you do something with words, all right, like disagreeing or offering or apologizing or inviting. I used to be an English teacher a very long time ago, and I remember trying to teach my Japanese students how to disagree. But this didn't go terribly well because in Japan, the examples of situations in which it's okay to disagree are different to the English ones. And my Japanese students, they could learn the words, but they just didn't want to do it because it was not comfortable in their culture. In contrast, when I went to live in Greece, I found that people would disagree with me very directly. And in the beginning, I was a bit hurt about that. You know, my feelings were hurt because I thought maybe they don't like me or maybe they think I'm stupid or something like that. But I came to realize that it's just that the culture has a different way of going about disagreeing. It's much more okay. People are more comfortable disagreeing in Greek than they are in English, and in English than they are in Japanese. Some Asian cultures, including Chinese, when you offer somebody something, they are not supposed to accept the first time. So that leads to a lot of Chinese students coming to Australia and being offered something and saying, no, 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 thank you very much. And then having the person take it away and getting really surprised because, you know, they're applying their home country pragmatics to this situation where it's a different way of doing things. Apologizing is another one. How often you apologize, what you apologize for, and so on. So if you compare again Japan and the United States, you'll find that Japanese people speaking English often tend to apologize a lot more than American people speaking English or Australian people speaking English. And that's because they're taking the norms of their own culture and translating them into the English words that they're using. Inviting, we've just talked about how, you know, what is a sincere invitation and how you know, and how warm you have to be when you're inviting somebody. So another different thing is what's considered polite and what's considered rude. In Australian English, we tend to be quite informal in the way that we do things and the way that we talk to people. You know, you wouldn't really talk to the Prime Minister that differently from the way you talk to your cleaner. Maybe a little bit more polite, I don't know, but not a whole different language. You know, in some languages, there's a whole different grammar for how you talk to people with more power than you. And so what's considered polite and rude, and also how are politeness and impoliteness actually done in that language. So there are many, many ways that languages differ. And when I'm talking about this, I'd like you to be thinking about your language and particularly how things are done differently from English, because English is really key in this. Here are a few other ways in which languages differ. Okay, some simple things, like, for example, the time. When is it considered morning, afternoon, and night? Now that's an easy one. It's probably a familiar one that you would either teach or you'd expect your students, because many of them grew up speaking the community language, to know that already. I mean, in English, morning is till 12 noon, and then afternoon starts immediately. And we don't have a separate time that we refer to as the midday. But in Greek you do, and I'm sure in some of your other languages you do. You might start the afternoon and evening at different times. So these things are related to your culture, but they reflect in your language. So, you know, when you say bonjour, that may not mean the same as good morning in terms of the actual hours it refers to. Maybe it's different in your language too. Another one is place. What's here and what's there? In English, we have two words for that. We have here and there. And we used to, in Old English, we had a word yonder, which we don't use very much these days, but it means sort of over there in the distance. Many other languages do make a distinction, and they distinguish between here and there according to whether it's close to the speaker or whether it's close to the hearer or whether it's far away from both of them. So Japanese is like that, for example, with kore, sore, are. So Japanese has 3 words, English only has 2. And when you're moving between those and thinking about, you know, how you make those meanings in different languages, the resources are different. Spanish has also got 3. So, you know, think about your language. How many different words for here and there have you got? And why might there be a problem for learners of the English, of the language? Languages have different formulae. And sometimes these are politeness formulae, sometimes they're responses. You can learn these off by heart, but you also have to learn when and where to use them and when and where not to use them. Greetings, for example. I mean, the classic mistake in English that people make when they're new to the language is not knowing the difference between nice to meet you and nice to see you. Right? Nice to see you, you would say when you've already met somebody. That you wouldn't say nice to meet you if you already know them. So they're examples of formulae, and every language has those. And the context in which you use them is really important. How to open and close conversations. Again, in English, we say, see you later. But if that's translated directly, it sometimes leads to an expectation that you really are going to see the person later. And maybe that is not always true. So think about how you open and close conversations and what contexts they occur in your language. When and how to show respect. Now that is really complex, isn't it? As I said, English tends to be quite egalitarian. So when an English speaker or somebody who's grown up in English tries to understand the complex systems of honorifics that you find in Korean, in Japanese, in maybe some other languages represented here, they often find that really difficult, and particularly to know not just how to use them, but when is appropriate. Forms of address sometimes convey respect, and so they're examples of things that are made different. The meanings about them are made differently in different languages. For example, the singular and plural. Does your language have a singular and plural that you might want to use? How and how often do you say please or thank you? In my experience, English speakers in Greece are always recognized, even if their Greek is very good, because they tend to say please and thank you in inappropriate contexts, and sometimes too much. Right? Greece is a positive politeness or an involvement culture. So if you say please and thank you too much, what you're doing is creating a distance between you and the other person. It's like saying, you know, we're not that close, so I have to say thank you and please. And that may be a meaning that people are not even aware that they're making. So here's a few more that we've talked about already. So when is an invitation or an offer real? When people say, let's have lunch sometime, do they mean that? You know, it depends. And how does that work in your culture? How sincere are people in what they say? And what questions can you ask and what can you not ask? And the classic ones in Australian English are you don't ask people what they earn. You generally don't ask people how old they are, unless there's some kind of excuse to do that, like it's a doctor's surgery or something. And what topics are taboo? So in Australia, we tend not to talk in a workplace about politics because we don't want to be aware of the differences that we have. But I know that's not the case everywhere. And finally, can you swear? And if so, how much can you swear and when can you swear? So we're getting a little bit out of the realm of what community language teachers are probably doing with their students here with swearing, but it's you know, it's part of the whole pragmatic picture here. So what I'd like you to do is to think about your languages and English, and I've arranged for Alex to put you into groups that are mixed so that you're going to have people from different languages. I'm just going to stop the share now so that I can put the questions in the chat. So I hope that was all right for everybody, and I'm not speaking too fast or anything for you. You can put questions in the chat and I'll have a look at them while you're doing the discussion. Now let me just put my questions in here so that you'll be able to see them. And what I want you to talk about is what are some of the ways in which the culture of your language and the way you use language, your language, is different from English. And I think we might get some interesting things here that show us what we're going to need to focus on in the teaching and learning of pragmatics. So I'm just going to put that in the chat now. Okay, so these are the questions. Oh, someone said not too fast. Thank you. That's great. Those are the questions, and Alex is going to put you into groups now. And you should be able to access those questions in the chat. So this bit won't be recorded. I'll wander around and go to the different rooms and just pop in and make sure that everyone's okay. Don't forget to unmute yourself. And if you have a camera, put your camera on while you're in the discussion rooms so that you'll be able to talk to people. Any questions before we do that?
I can't see the question.
Can you see the chat? Down the bottom of the screen, there's a little speech bubble that says chat. Can you see that?
You did a comment?
I can't see in the chats.
You did a comment?
Okay, they can't see the chat, Alex. What are we going to do about that?
Well, I can see it.
I can see it too. There's a lot of messages in the chat. At the very bottom of the screen, you should be able to see it.
Now we can see the questions, yes.
Oh, that's good. Okay, great. Maybe they just took a little while to come up. Do you have any questions of me before you do that? Okay, so you can join in the breakout rooms, and in 10 minutes, Alex will close them. We'll come back together and we'll discuss. Great.
Cool.
Okay, we started recording again. Over to you, Jill.
Okay, thanks everyone. Well, I only managed to get into one group actually because the conversation was so interesting. So I didn't hear what other people were talking about. But the group I was in were talking about the singular and plural and how they use that to convey respect. And I know that a lot of other languages have got different forms of address that you use. They also talked about how in Turkish and I think also in Malay, there's this idea of calling close family members uncle and auntie, and how that that sometimes transferred to people's Australian English, and they would call people auntie and uncle even though we don't do that so much in English. Somebody made a really interesting comment about formality in the classroom and how the way that you address a teacher in a real classroom in their country tends to be really respectful, and you wouldn't ever call them by their first name. And of course the kids here did that, and so she had to make a decision about when when to give them that feedback, and to decide, is it more important to have the rapport, or is it more important to have the correct pragmatic use of language? So I'd just like to see whether anybody could give me, maybe one or two interesting points that were made in their group. Now, to do that, you're going to have to unmute and just put up your hand, and put your camera on, put up your hand or something so that I can see you. And then, because otherwise we have a lot of people in the group. Okay, Kathy would like to say something. Do you want to just unmute yourself, Kathy? You don't want to say something? Maybe you just
okay.
What's you're a Chinese teacher?
Yes, in a Chinese language school.
Yes.
That's very useful, training for us, Jill. I really appreciate Jill and Alex for your organizing.
Thank you.
In our breakout room, we just discussed the difference between our community language and English. For example, in Chinese speaking, we call uncle, auntie, grandma, grandpa with some neighborhood or strangers.
Mhm.
That's kind of way to show our respect, and not because they are our relative.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a little bit different.
Do you teach your
With
students that, or do they already know when they come to your class?
because most of the students comes from Chinese background, so they got the general idea. However, we can see some positive side. At this moment, some of the non-Chinese background attend Chinese language school on the weekend. So that's the issue, and the experienced teacher needed to pay attention about that. Needed to explain more about the culture differences. Yeah, just to share it with you guys.
Chinese, one of the things about Chinese that strikes me as very complicated in terms of language is the kinship system, that you have so many different words for different relations, different family relations that we don't have in English. So if they grew up in a family speaking Chinese, that's going to be easy for them. But if not, it's going to be something which is really challenging. So thank you for sharing that. Is there anyone else who's got a comment or anything they'd like to share from their discussion in the breakout room?
I just want to ask, in my group, we had some recommend that you should start in the high school teaching pragmatic. Can you recommend what age you should start?
That's a really difficult question because it depends very much on the background of the students. You know, if the students are really young and they're growing up, I think you're an Arabic speaking teacher, are you? Yeah, they're growing up speaking Arabic. They're not going to need very much in terms of pragmatics because they'll be getting it from their parents, right? They'll be getting it from the environment that they're in. But and it's later on that they're going to start making mistakes. But if they're not, if they're growing up in an environment where they're not exposed to Arabic, it's very important really early on to start not teaching them really in a really heavy-handed way, but just drawing their attention to the way things are done naturally in Arabic. And a lot of that is about creating the context where people communicate. Okay, so we'll be, I know that's not a very straight answer to your question, but very often the answers to questions like that are, it depends. You know, it depends a lot on the different situations.
So you recommend to start early age?
I recommend to start early.
Slowly.
If you can find that there are communication difficulties related to pragmatics. If they're not, if the kids, for example, are addressing you the way they would address an ordinary Arabic teacher back home, if they're talking to each other and talking to their parents and they're understanding things all right, you always keep it in your mind yourself, but you don't necessarily have to teach it really actively. But if you find that that the children are making errors or that they're not understanding things or that they're transferring English pragmatic norms into their Arabic, then you have to take a more dynamic approach to it.
Okay, maybe Jessica is right because me and Jessica had that discussion. Yeah.
Okay. Somebody else. Oh, yes. Okay, Jessica. Yes.
Yeah, so Layla basically asked my question. So after your explanation, I'm very clear. So I think you and me are thinking the same thing. So for like, I teach Chinese students. For students with Chinese background, we don't have to.
After you.
We don't have to emphasize the cultural, context or differences that much because they have grown up in their family and they experience the culture. But instead, if you teach Australian children Chinese, because they grow up from another culture, they don't know the differences and they never experience that. So you need to draw this to their attention, but you don't have to teach this very heavily, like what you said.
Yeah,
But,
that's good as a rule of thumb, but there are a few little situations where that doesn't quite apply. And I will be talking about this later, but I'll just foreground it now. And that is that the situations that they meet in the family are limited. So if they were living in China, they'd get to interact with a lot more different people in different situations, and they'd be able to learn from those interactions. If they're in a Chinese community in Australia, it's not a complete community. So I wouldn't ignore the pragmatic aspects, but you need to think a little bit about the situations that they're not involved in outside the family. Okay, I'll come to that in a minute. Somebody else has mentioned body language that I've lost it now, but it was in the chat, I think, that Greeks talk with their hands and gestures, and sometimes, sometimes the gestures are not the same. That's true. I wasn't going to talk about non-verbal communication particularly tonight, but it is true that sometimes the way that you say something with a gesture can have a completely different meaning. I think we probably need a whole session on that. That's really, really valuable. Okay, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint again, which I hope you'll be able to see. And we've talked about a lot of ways here in which languages differ. And now we're going to move on to the types of pragmatic knowledge that you want your students to have. So there are two types. One is what we call pragmalinguistic, and that's knowing the right words and expressions to use. So you know what to call your aunt in Chinese. You know how to say sir in Turkish, and so on, and when to say it. But there's also this cultural thing, this socio-pragmatic knowledge, and that is knowing what to do and say. And so socio-pragmatic is, let me just give you an example there. Pragmalinguistic would be knowing the phrases that you need to express disagreement. All right, so how to say, I disagree with you, or you're wrong, or I think maybe you could think of that in a different way if you want to be more polite. But socio-pragmatic is knowing whether it's okay to do that thing at all. Okay, so you're looking not just at knowing the language, but knowing the time that the language should be used, when it should be used. And these are the types of pragmatic knowledge. Okay, so that's a discussion there that we just had. And we've come up with a lot of interesting things. Now, we didn't get to the end of the list, sadly, because we only have a short time. But I think that these are things that you might like to keep on considering and keep on thinking about, even if you didn't have a chance to talk about them all in your group. Now, we have to be really careful when we start saying, you know, Chinese people do this, or Turkish people do this, or Malay speakers do this, or whatever, to not create stereotypes. So rather than say, you know, people from such and such a country are very direct, or they interrupt a lot, or they don't say what they mean, or they say please too often, what we need to do is think of it in terms of particular examples in the context when that happens and when it doesn't. Okay, so you're always trying to raise the awareness of students to not just the words and phrases people use, but how they behave in the real world in that culture. So you teach the language and the behavior together with the contextual information. And what your goal is for your students to have pragmatic competence. And that is being able to communicate successfully, having the pragmatic knowledge, knowing all the things that are used in your language to make these interpersonal meanings, being able to apply it in a real life situation. And finally, this is a really important one, and we often don't think about that, continuing to learn from communication experience. So it's important to give the students the opportunity to be aware of when what they do doesn't actually work. You know, when they can get feedback, when they can understand that they haven't done something correctly. So for community language students, your goals are to be able to communicate without misunderstandings and embarrassment. That's what you want them to be able to do. And also to avoid feeling like an outsider in their own culture when they go back. So sometimes they can feel like an outsider because they don't use the same pragmatic norms that are used in that culture. So learners who are not taught about pragmatics learn these things very slowly or not at all. We know that, but they just don't, if they're not in an environment where they're being fully socialized, they don't learn these things. Now, we've talked a little bit in the groups already about the first use of the first language. And in a context, like a natural context, people acquire pragmatic knowledge by experience, interacting and using the language in real contexts. But in fact, they might be able to interact with their grandparents, with other kids, with their fathers and so on. But in the community language context, the real reality of it is much more complicated. So in the home, they may have a rich environment of pragmatics where, many people visit the home, where they go to many different contexts and use that language, or it might be partial. They might use the language only, say, with their grandmothers, and then they only learn about how to talk to grandmothers. They don't learn anything more broadly. Sometimes the situation is even worse, and it may not happen at all. They might not actually be using their language in the home at all. And I know many of you have classes that are mixed between people with a rich environment or a partial environment, or none at all. And the none at all option, unfortunately, is happening more and more because our migration in Australia has been going on for a very long time. And we have a lot of families who are third or fourth generation, or who are mixed marriages. So that means that only one parent speaks the community language. And that means that the only interaction they might get is with that one parent. Okay, so it's important for teachers to have a bit of a sense of what their students' family background is and what they're going to be able to be exposed to. And the other important thing to remember is that there's an influence in English, a very strong influence in English. And what it actually develops is a sort of a hybrid system of pragmatics where they're using sort of half Chinese or half Arabic or half Greek or half Turkish and half English. And you'll find them, particularly as they get more advanced and they're trying to do more complicated things, making more mistakes. Another thing which I don't have time to talk about in detail tonight, but it's very interesting, and I've done some research on this myself, and that is within the diaspora, within the people living in Australia from these different countries, sometimes different pragmatic norms develop, right? And that is that, Australian Greeks use a slightly different system of pragmatics to Greek Greeks because they've been here a very long time. And I think that's probably quite likely to be the case with many communities who have been here for a long time. And that includes the teachers. So, not all of the teachers actually have up-to-date pragmatic knowledge. And that's something that it's not a disaster, but it's a challenge. It's something that you need to think about. Are you teaching them the language that they need to talk to other people from their background in Australia, or to talk to people when they go home, or both? And then how do you manage that? So sometimes pragmatics does get neglected a little bit in classes in Australia, and there are various reasons for that. But I'm just going to skip through this because time is getting away a little bit, and just come to some more practical techniques and things that you can use for teaching. First of all, how can you make children aware of pragmatics? Well, you can do it by explicit teaching, giving them opportunities to notice things and giving them opportunities to practice. And these things can be separated or integrated. They can be in one lesson, or they can just be a few minutes focused on pragmatics in a lesson which is really focused on something else. So you can be teaching grammar or skills or something like that, and just keeping aware of opportunities for helping students to learn about pragmatics. Okay, here's an example. This is what we call a language function, and it's asking for permission. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about the changes in methodology and curriculum design that led us to this point. I know that many of you are doing theme or topic-based teaching. And, and in older times, we used to teach with a different sort of curriculum, which was based on situations, you know, like at the shop, or functions, that is doing things with language, like asking for permission and so on. And as we moved to a theme-based, task-based way of teaching, some of these things that were useful got thrown out a bit, like the baby with the bathwater. You know, it's something that maybe people are not doing so much anymore. But if you want students to be pragmatically competent, you need to go back to thinking about how to do what we call speech acts. And asking for permission is an example of a speech act that you might be teaching. So when you're teaching something like this, it's usually something that the students already know something about, and you can draw on their knowledge. So ask them for some situations where they might ask for permission, for example, and list those situations on the board from their real lives. If they've got good fluency in the community language, you may be doing all of this in the community language, or you might be doing some of it in English. Those of you who went to our session last year on translanguaging, you know that you can move a little bit between languages. So think about which ones need to be more polite, which ones involve people who are close or people that you don't know so well. And then what do you have to do with language when you ask for permission? So you don't just ask for permission, like, can I, in the example I showed you, can I pat your dog? Usually there's something that goes before and something that goes after. So you might have to attract the person's attention, ask if you can do it. And then if the answer is yes, say thank you. And then if the answer is no, you need to know what to say in that situation. So activities could be discussing which responses are the most appropriate. And also, if you change something about the context, how would the language be different? So if we go back to our picture here, oops, we're going the wrong direction here. If this was an older person, would you ask differently? If it was somebody that you knew, would you ask differently? If it was another child, would you ask differently? So this gives the students the sensitivity to how you change your language according to context. After you presented it, then you need to reinforce it continually. So some ways of doing that are group dialogue writing, creating posters showing who the people are and where the conversation happened, maybe drawing speech balloons and things like that. Ongoing follow-up, you can point out examples when you see them in teaching materials or in life. So, you know, if you've been talking about how to ask permission and somebody in class asks permission, then you draw the other student's attention to that. Or you draw the attention to an example in real life where that might happen in something else that you're reading. So a lot of this is about keeping your curriculum coherent, you know, so that you can keep recycling things. And often you can't plan these, they arise spontaneously. So part of your pragmatic awareness as a teacher is how to recognize and make the most of these opportunities. Okay, for an ongoing follow-up, pointing out the examples, an optional exercise that you might do for more advanced students is to think about how the forms and uses differ in your language from English. And I've just put in the PowerPoint there's an example there that you can look at when you look at the slides afterwards. There are many, many, many examples of free teaching materials for functions in English. And they're interesting for you to look at because English is to a large extent where your students are coming from, what you want them to go beyond. So it's good for you to know in each example of a function how that would be different in your language and in English. So that's sort of more for you than for them. Now, I'm aware that it's already 8 o'clock, so I know that some people need to go, but there's a couple more things that I'd like to share with you, even though sadly, I don't think we're going to be able to have time to do the last group activity. But that's okay, we'll just do as much as we can. So if it's okay, I'll go for a little bit longer. If you need to leave, that's all right. Okay, do any of you teach using stories? Now, stories are not going to be useful for teaching pragmatics unless there's some kind of communication happening in the story. But fortunately, usually there is. And stories give you an opportunity to take students out of the family situation and put them into something which is outside of their experience. This is particularly important for the students who are not getting pragmatic input at home. So I'm sure you know how to teach stories, but thinking of it from a pragmatic point, let's just see what we can maybe get out of using a story that you may not have thought of already. So first of all, you need to think about, is it good to use a story that the students already know in English, or is it better just to use a story from your language? Well, I've chosen a story from English because I know that it's a very, very well-known one. And sometimes particularly if you have a lot of students who are not strong in a language, going from something that they know to something that they don't know is an easier transition than just starting off, immediately from something completely foreign to them. So you can, if you wanted to use an English fairy tale, for example, you can translate it into your language, or you can find a translation of the story. Many of these European ones are already translated into many different languages. So I picked Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf because I know that many European children already know that language, that story. Another good thing about doing ones that are well known is that often there are video tellings of those that you can access on YouTube. And I've got here a link to one, which I won't be able to show you. And it's actually kind of annoying because there are a lot of ads in this one, but you can often find ones that are just designed to be used, not for language particularly, but for just for storytelling with English-speaking children, and teach the necessary vocabulary. But the difference is when you're focusing on pragmatics, that you're looking at who were the people and what happened and what kind of communication is involved. So if we look at Little Red Riding Hood, I just took a couple of clips from this video, and this is really easy to do. You just use the snipping tool, you pause the video, and you can take any pictures that you want out. And you already know that there are so many wonderful creative things that you can do with these pictures. But what's important is getting the students to notice who's talking to whom. So for example, when Little Red Riding Hood talks to her grandmother and her mother, and when she calls for help, and when the wolf is, I hope you know this story, if not, there are reference links to it, when the wolf has sort of attacked and eaten her grandmother, you can look at the different role relationships there. And you can use an English video without sound and get the students to call out what they think the people are saying in their own language. So in telling the story, in Little Red Riding Hood, here are just a few things that happens. The child asks for permission. Okay, so it's her mother, so she asks for permission in a very informal way. And you can link that up to anything else that you've done related to that function. The mother agrees and tells her to be careful. She meets the wolf and they have a conversation, where are you going? And she tells the wolf where she's going. And then she arrives and she has that conversation with her grandmother, who's not really her grandmother, because he's really the wolf. And then she runs away and she asks the woodcutter for help. So there are lots of different communication situations with different sorts of politeness in a story like that. And I'm sure that many of you have got other stories that you've told many times, but you may not have thought about focusing on why the people talk differently to each other in different parts of the story and how it relates to who they are. And finally, you've already got a lot of pragmatic information in your own textbook dialogues. So maybe some of you are using textbooks and some of you are producing your own materials, but if you're using textbooks, they don't always have an active pragmatic focus, but the information is there. You just need to be able to find it. So you look critically at what's available in the materials that you have and what cultural information they provide and whether you need to supplement them in some way. And many textbooks that I've looked at English textbooks used in Vietnam, for example, with one of my students. I've looked at textbooks for teaching Greek in Australia. And very often there's there's a fairly narrow range of people participating in the dialogues. And the way that the people interact with each other is not always maybe natural. So you might need to add something, and you might need to create a wider range of people than the students usually interact with. Now, one good way of doing this is to get some pictures, like I've done here, to introduce some different characters to your classroom. And when you teach something, or just when you encounter something, say, how would you say it if you were talking to her? How would you say it if you were talking to her? You know, how do you think he'd say it if he was talking to her? Right? And that brings in other people from the outside world. So there are many creative things that you can do like that. Now, sadly, we're not going to have time to do the rest of the discussion, but these are the kind of things that you want to think about when you're considering context. So remember, any text that you use with your students, a song, a poem, a story, anything has got pragmatic information in it if the people are communicating. And the students just need to know who they are, what the relationships are, where they are, and what they're trying to do by communicating. And you can actually create a context where that will be clear for the students. You have to do it in a vivid kind of way. Okay, so there's the discussion that we didn't get done. Also, games, any games that you already use can be about pragmatic information. So they can include things like a matching game, where the students have to match an utterance, somebody says something, and a response that go together well. All right, and when they're doing that, they're learning about pragmatics. They're practicing pragmatics. Memory card games can be things about pragmatics. So what go together? What sort of things match? And you probably already have things in your repertoire of games that you can think about using. So to sum up, using strong models of people, using language in real life situations is really important in your teaching, and emphasizing the participants' relationships and the desired outcomes. And that will give your students a chance to notice things like social roles, names, forms of address, and so on. The cultural context also needs to be emphasized. So the time, the place, the surroundings, things like even the dress, what they're wearing, other cultural artifacts. So you need to find lots of quality visual information to provide that backup from the dialogues and things that you're using in your materials. And that'll give you the opportunity to focus on aspects of the context of the interaction that might be unfamiliar to the learners. And it'll give you an opportunity to provide practice opportunities for students to use the new language in varied contexts so that they become sensitized to pragmatic differences. So finally, just about any example of communication in context is an opportunity to teach pragmatics. And I hope that you found that interesting and thought-provoking. Thanks for listening and for participating in the discussion. And if there are any quick questions, I might be able to try to deal with them if Alex will let me have an extra few minutes. So.
Not a problem, absolutely.
Okay, are there any questions or thoughts that people would like to add? I'm seeing a few things in the chat there that people have found it useful, and that's great. Any other comments?
Could you?
Mehmet, is that you?
Yes, could you put the second last slide back up, please?
Sure. You'll get a copy of these slides, by the way, but I can certainly do that. This one? Is that the one that you want? Ah.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Did you have a comment to make about it or a question?
No, Jill,
you just want to see it.
Taking a photo of it.
Any other comments or questions?
Short and quite useful, says Kathy, but it's a really quick introduction to pragmatics. I think basically, Jill, the thing is that a lot of teachers, even with experience, tend to sometimes forget, or some, not everybody, they tend to forget the importance of authentic material. So authentic language is so important. We've got to be careful not to. I think this is the message that we should all be sharing, is that we've got to be careful not to just look at textbooks and thinking that the textbook is going to be what our teaching program is going to be. Because believe me, there are still people that think, well, we're just going to work with the textbook, and the language that's in the textbook is going to get us across the line. Unfortunately, a lot of textbooks, a lot of material that we do get from abroad, and I'm not. Well, basically, it's going to be quite jaded, or it's quite artificial language. And I think this is where what you're talking about today makes a lot of sense, because it's the most natural language that we need to teach the students. We've got to keep this in mind.
That's exactly right, Alex. Yeah, thanks for making that comment. I appreciate how little time community language teachers have, and how dedicated they are with what they're already doing. And I feel almost guilty saying, well, you have to do a bit more. But a lot of that, what I'm really talking about is not so much the hours that you spend preparing your lessons and doing that. It's just that if you have pragmatics in the back of your mind all the time, and you think about it, and you think about the differences between your language and where the students are coming from, it's not really that much more to do. It just means that you're always thinking about it. And when an opportunity comes up to mention it in class, you will. You won't lose that opportunity. Someone had a hand up there. Was there a question?
Jill,
Yes, Varsha.
this is Varsha here. While in the breakout room, as I was discussing, like, it's okay for small kids to call me with my name. What I feel we need to be doing is adapt to the Australian way of living, because these kids are going to be in Australia for their life. So we need to be very mindful. We are training them to be respectful, first of all, within and outside the culture too. It's not just about Indian cultures. They would be interacting with people who don't belong to Indian culture, but still they should be able to show them the part of them that is Indian. So it's more about adapting to the situation, coming up with new vocabulary, coming up with new ways they can communicate. And definitely the target language is the main thing. And I like your Red Riding Hood story, asking kids to put the volume down and asking them to discuss what they might say in the target language. That's really one good exercise, and kids come up with fantastic ideas, fantastic things. So they need to adapt. Teachers need to adapt to Australian living.
Thanks, Varsha. And I think that's an important question. Are you teaching your children to go back to India or China, or are they going to live here and speak their language here? And if that's the case, then maybe the hybrid form is what you need to be encouraging, right? If they're going to go back, or if the real, the thing about their identity as a member of that culture is related to their parents' home country, then the home country norms are more important.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody individually will have a different answer to that.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody says, I get my books from abroad and I make it relevant for my students. We are good actresses. Teachers have to be good actors and actresses. That's a very good point. Any other, maybe one last question or thought?
Like,
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Vasiliki. Thank you for coming.
Fatima?
Yep. Hi, Alex. Hi, Jill. Thank you for the
Hi,
session.
Fatima.
I want to share the situation in my language. Like, the language is evolving, every language evolving in such a high speed. Like, if I look back to my language, I speak Bangla. It's already very rich with words from Farsi, Arabic, then Urdu, Hindi, and also English. So it's nowadays when I try to teach them that what is the actual Bangla word for what in any English word, but I can see that in the native land they are not using that word anymore. They're using more like, we don't say please in our language. But nowadays, it's in this transition time, people are using please with the word please itself. So it becomes,
yeah, it's fascinating.
yeah, even at this time, it's happening in such a high speed, and there is a local dialect, there is a written form, there is oral form. Then in those form, everything is changing in such a high speed. Then teaching them, what I try to do in my class is that I let them know, and I don't make them to do it, but I give them a choice, whichever you want to do, but this is what you can do, this is what is acceptable here, this is what wasn't acceptable there. I just let them know and let them take their decision, because every parent is different as well.
That's a very good point, and I think it's really challenging when the language is changing around you. Yeah, but so long as they're sensitive to what context is and what it means, they will adapt to that. You know, if they have to talk to somebody in a context that they're not used to, just the fact that they know about how context changes language, I think is really key. Marlonette, I had a hand up there. Did you have
Hi, Jill.
Yeah, hi.
I just wanted to also make a point that in Hindi also, we've now got a lot of English words which have been converted to Hindi, and they are used, they're in the dictionary. And we also have a mixture of Urdu words which are used for day-to-day spoken language in India. So a lot of the students, when they see Hindi films and all, they relate to those words. But when it comes down to studying for the HSC, we have to be mindful that we actually, we have to point out the difference to them so that they don't use those words in their examination.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because the language in the HSC is less authentic than the language which has really been spoken in their home country.
And there are some purist words which are no longer used in day-to-day language, you know.
Indeed, yes, interesting. Somebody made a comment in the chat there too that we don't know whether people are going to stay in Australia forever or go back to their own cultures. We just don't know that.
Yeah,
so in a sense, we're in a difficult situation having to prepare them for both. But the awareness and giving them the choice, I think, is the way to approach
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a wonderful session. Thank you
for coming.
Alex.
I think we'll probably have to wind that up now because I have gone quite a bit over time. And I know some of you are probably, if you're in Sydney, you're dying to get outside and have a look at the lunar eclipse. Yeah.
Yes.
I am. Yes. Hey, so let's
Happy
do that.
Buddh. It's actually the festival of Buddh Purnima, the birth of Lord Buddha today. So we can wish everybody happy Buddh Purnima.
Thank you. Right. Good night. Good night to good evening or to everyone else.